Hi everyone, this week 8 I'm previewing the readings with you, again showing how they apply to the notion of both fear and the manipulation of emotions. What's really nice is the academic reading I'm going to be going over, the Wisniewski article et al. Really helps to apply this notion of intrinsic and intrinsic engagement with an activity, creating again a feeling inside. Um, as well as this notion of fulfillment. Again, this academic reading gets my Dr. Seuss seal of approval. So I think we're up to 4 or 5 now. that some academic readings I like, some I'm like, this is a little bit too abstract. This one's a good one. And again, when they're good, when they're simple, when they're direct, when they give you great examples, that can help you really work well with your final project, which has to do with motivation, in which you're supposed to come up with 4. I've already pointed out at least 4 that get my seal of approval as really helpful and applicable. So pay attention. You may just use those 4 if you like. Anyway, let's go right to the readings. This is the Ekman book, Chapter 7, Surprise and Fear. Again, that's our theme. Not only fear, but manipulation and exploitation around emotions, especially fear, and what we can do about it. I was not that pleased with this particular chapter. I thought it was a fairly weak chapter by Ekman, as much as I liked some of the other ones. I didn't find this one actually that enlightening. He goes, first of all, and puts surprise in with fear and considers it an emotion, and he begins to explain why. I don't really buy his reasoning. So again, I encourage you to be critical, not only with the text, but even with me. Here's the picture he has. These guys are surprised because this woman was being lifted by her teeth, and she was not able to hold on, and she fell some 35 feet below, back onto some boards and stuff, and she did injure herself, but she didn't die. And these guys were like, oh, here's the reason I don't think it's an emotion. Here's the reason why that is Ekman, does think emotion. This is on page 150. He's saying some emotion scholars do not consider surprise to be an emotion because they say it is neither pleasant nor unpleasant, and they claim that all emotions must be one or another. I disagree. I think surprise feels like an emotion to most people. He might even point out that it is episodic, has a beginning and an end. It has an object. We're surprised about something, so it fits those definitions of emotion. But here's the problem, in my mind. There's no cognitive appraisal. It is reactive, and there's no way, as soon as you engage it consciously, it's not a surprise. How do you work on surprise? In other words, I think it's possible to work on being startled. That's what he calls not an emotion, but just a reaction or a reflex. You can get used to it. But I don't really see either the reason or the way to work on surprise. So to me, even if it were an emotion, if you characterize that or not, it's not terribly useful because it's just something that happens. Now, the one usefulness that we've already discovered in this class is that surprise, when you do something to someone else that's surprising or different, something pleasant or nice, they actually give greater credence to it. And it actually affects them in a bigger way than if you do something that's expected. Now, that kind of use of surprise, I really appreciate, and we tried it in our class, and it works really well. So if you're going to use surprise, I would say, how are we going to use it to really help us develop better relationships, increase our understanding of emotions and emotional intelligence? And right now, I think surprise's main contribution is that when you do something surprisingly good for someone, it has a much greater impact. Other than that, I don't see a whole lot of need for surprise as a discussion about it. It's just pleasant or it's unpleasant. We learn to deal with it. So he did, like I said, he went through and saying startling is not an emotion, it's more of a reaction, and then he goes through and begins to explain the 3 reasons why. Again, this is on page 151, okay? Timing of startle is much more constricted. It's like an immediate reaction. It's not fixed in any emotion. Second, being told you're about to be startled by a very loud noise reduces maybe your anxiety or your action, but it doesn't eliminate it like a big noise. But I would argue even with that, construction people who get used to loud noises don't even flinch at a certain point. So I think again, some of the things he's saying are not necessarily true. It's not a physical reflex sometimes, especially if you're around it for a long time, like a construction worker. So I'm not really buying a lot of this argument. It seems kind of academic, not terribly useful. Here on page 152 is something that's a little bit useful. It says, there's been more research on fear than any other emotion, probably because it's easy to arouse fear in nearly any animal, including rats. The threat of harm, either physical or psychological harm, characterizes all fear triggers, theme, and variation. So it's a very basic emotion, fear is. It has to do with harm or response to harm, physical or psychological. So, again, it does merit quite a bit of research as a result. There are unlearned triggers for fear, something hurtling through you at your head or something, of course, going to make you want to duck or be afraid. Okay, we get that. And then here it goes. And I had said this before, seems to be an actual place in our brain that responds to the shape of a snake in a very startled way. And that's not learned. But then he said there's some people who are not that afraid of snakes. Again, I think this has to do with people who are exposed continually. So their brain learns to accommodate and almost filter it out when you're dealing with that. Again, fear, there are lots of different responses: flee, freeze, or anger. And you get that anger every time someone starts to scare you. And first you're surprised, and then you're mad at them for getting you surprised. Like, what'd you do that for? Okay, all right. That's at least somewhat helpful to understand the different responses. Now, here's usually, okay, yeah. It says immediate threat usually leads to action, freezing or flight that deals with the threat, while worry about an impending threat leads to vigilance and muscular tension, right? An impending threat seems to magnify pain. And this gets into surprise or fear and then starts getting into anxiety. Now, he says anxiety is not an emotion. I think you can classify anxiety as emotion. I disagree with him. That's why I have anxiety as one of my class of emotions, because an intensely felt anxiety over a test or something can have a beginning and an end. But anxiety itself doesn't necessarily have to have an object. It can simply be this building of stress. Okay, he calls it a mood. It can be more short term, or it can have a beginning and end, or it can be a mood. I think it can be either one. We talked about deadlines. I think deadlines is an anxiety over getting something done, oftentimes, and it has a beginning and end because the deadline ends at a certain point. So again, good old Ekman and I don't seem to have all the same ideas on these sorts of things. And that's what he said here. I use the term anxiety for the mood in which we feel worried and don't know why we are feeling that way, and we can't point to the trigger. Okay, well, sometimes we can, but we're just not sure how we're going to respond or how we're going to perform. That can also be anxiety or anxiousness. These are some interesting distinctions, and I thought I'd just pass them out there. One prominent researcher, Jerome Kagan, suggests that parents typically distinguish 3 different fear-related traits. Parents call children who avoid people shy, those who avoid unfamiliar situations timid, and those who avoid unfamiliar foods finicky. I thought those were kind of some interesting nuances there. I don't know what we can really go with it, but it kind of shows the different forms that fear can take and the kinds of words or the social concepts we bring to them, especially in the West. In the Eastern and other places, that wouldn't be so true. You might even say in Asian cultures, people who avoid other people who are looked down are considered polite or even respectful, not shy. It's in this more brash, individualistic, look them in the eyes Western culture that these kinds of words come around. This shows you also how social constructs, cultural constructs, what I call sociocultural variables, affect how we see things like fear and affect how we evaluate them, and indeed affect how we work through them. Okay, well, that was Ekman, and really, I'm only having you do one academic reading. It's a long academic reading, but it is actually quite good. It has a lot of insights in it. The other one is a little repetitious, so I didn't even bother with it. Now, the academic reading we're doing is coming from this book, Flourishing, a book on positive psychology and the life well lived by Corey Keyes and Jonathan Haidt. The actual article is the chapter 8 in this book. It's called Working, Playing, and Eating, Making the Most of Most Moments. Amy Wierzniewski, Paul Rosen, and Gwen Bennett. I like so many of the ideas in here. I find them very useful. So we're going to take a little bit of time on this. We're at 10 minutes now. I'll probably spend another 10 minutes or 15 on this. And that will conclude this video. But again, they're looking for accounts of work, leisure, and eating. Very central aspects of our society, both for pleasure and for survival. But the neat thing about them is they're so often connected to so much of the time we spend in our lives, and so much of the depth and breadth of our emotional life happens around work, leisure, and eating. So we're getting at nice applied arenas here. And so this is a very worthwhile areas of investigation. And he says, it is reasonable to assume that even the more positive these experiences, the better the quality of life. Again, that's one of the real focuses in this class, moving from being helpless, unconscious, and consumed by the drama of negative emotions, becoming aware, investigating, learning into these emotions, and then developing higher quality of life as we become more aware of how to manage, how to work through, how to transform negative emotions, and see them as learning experiences into more positive and more stable situations. So I love this. I love this definition, so I'm just going to read it. We propose that intrinsic value and fulfillment are two critical characteristics of activities that enhance their positivity and contribution to the quality of life. Intrinsic value is found in the accomplishment of an activity for its own sake, as opposed to accomplishment for some other purpose, such as for its instrumental value, i.e., doing something for someone else or because you think someone else wants you to do it, right? Or being a particular type of person when you're on a date because you think that person likes, that's an instrumental, okay? You're doing something, usually somewhat inauthentic, in order to achieve some goal that you want, okay, by going through some other method. Oftentimes say an inauthentic way of dealing with yourself in order to get affection from someone, for instance, versus an intrinsic, right, value, which says, listen, I'm going to share who I am at an intrinsic level, okay, and that person is going to either accept that or not accept that, and I'm glad. If that person rejects me, then good. I don't want to be around with someone who doesn't accept me in this deep way, and and if that person does accept you for that, then then it probably will lead to a much more healthy or stable situation in the future. So that's the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental. They've explained it fairly well here. It says fulfillment refers to a sense that one is a better person in terms of personal and societal goals as a result of participation in an activity. Again, the whole notion of production, contribution, and creation, that is giving of yourself rather than taking, is really key to fulfillment. Advertisements will say, take this pill, take this service, and you'll be happy. Whereas these more notions of fulfillment say, give in these ways, volunteer in these ways, connect in these ways, and you'll be happy. Really, really an important point to establish here. Can't overemphasize it. If you want long-lasting, stable, deeply held sense of happiness or positive emotions, they really tend to go with contributing, giving, and extending yourself, creating, initiating, rather than simply sitting there looking to consume somebody else's formula of what it means to be happy, and in the end, it not really resonating, or becoming addictive and replacing the development of your own capacities and your own risks and your own struggles, which again, dumbs you down, keeps you at an immature level when it comes to emotional intelligence and development. So again, very well taken, this situation here. So again, we're working with these different domains, and they make a couple more distinctions. It said we're going to work with the domain of work first, okay, and then we're going to go to leisure, and then they're going to go to eating. He says, in English, the word callings describes a positive framework of fulfilling work. That's my calling, my deep calling. That's something I can't not do. And the word passions is what they used for a positive, like deeply fulfilling, intrinsic notion of leisure, doing hobbies or volunteering and something about you're passionate about. A lot of you talked about social work or nursing or caring in that way, and that you're passionate in terms of that work. Um, this passions are talking about combined intrinsic value, like you're doing it because you truly deeply believe in it, and fulfillment. In other words, you get so much out of it, get so much out of your ability to work in this arena and to provide something in this arena. So let's keep on going. Um, these scribbles here are are the objectives for the class for this week that just came to me, and I just needed to find some white space to share it on. So that shows you a little bit about my thinking. Anyway, again, work. Most people must work to make a living, which makes work an obligation rather than a choice. Okay, so how we're going to deal with this notion that work can be both an obligation and a choice. We go, and it has a very high relative importance to a person's sense of self. And again, we talked about the different words about understanding self in our last week: self-concept, self-esteem, self-image, and self-worth. Here's an interesting notion that there are three basic orientations: an intrinsic motivation for working, having to do with advancement, achievement, and recognition. Well, that's actually, oh, that's extrinsic, right? Intrinsic has to do more with doing work because it's creative or fulfilling. Um, Extrinsic motivations for work include pay, working conditions, and job security. Okay, and so forth. And he lists three different kinds. Okay, we'll go on this one too. An ongoing debate in the meaning of work literature centers on whether the meaning of work is determined internally, that is within the individual, or externally by the job and wider environment. Okay. Again, this is important for our notion of emotional intelligence and how we're manipulated, because if we're motivated by external or instrumental notions, whether it's be at a job or whether it is for our personal satisfaction, we tend to reach outside of ourselves and think that that's where our source of happiness and fulfillment is going to be. If we're motivated more by an intrinsic or internal locus of control or focus, oftentimes we think being able to address this is what's going to create happiness. Again, most research will show that oftentimes an extrinsic or external grasp for happiness or pay or advancement, which is a more internal, external motivation, will work for a while and then it diminishes. The people that really go and last for a long time and have higher satisfaction over a longer period of time and the satisfaction grows tend to be more internally motivated. So that's an important part. You know, pay is not unimportant, but it turns out that most people really look for job satisfaction and creativity in internal sources after their pay meets a basic minimum level. And that's an important thing to say. Okay, so there's external aspects of work like skill variety, task, and so forth. There's the relationship or social appeal of work, right? In which you're working with others, and relationships are a very important part of work. And then again, the internal aspects as well, right? Creativity and so forth. Let's see here. Oh, I like these distinctions. This is on page 188. These are nice distinctions. Three very clear ways to see a job that go with three very clear ways of understanding emotion and well-being. The first way of understanding work is to see it as a job, right? Focusing on the material benefits of work to the relative exclusion of other things. In this kind of work, where you see it as a job, it's external or instrumental, and you're doing it to get money to do the things you really like. So really, you're putting your brain on hold to a certain degree. Now, the next one, notion of job, is a career. This is a primarily social understanding of it, right? You work for rewards. It's still a little bit extrinsic, right? It comes through advancement through an organizational, occupational structure. You're looking for a career, increased pay, prestige, and status, promotion, and advancement. So again, it has to do with your standing among others. So it's purely social. So it's one step up from just looking at his job just to get money and get the heck out of there. Now you're seeing some benefit that kind of mixes internal and intrinsic and extrinsic, having to do with the social and relationship aspects. And then finally, the strongest one that brings the higher self-esteem and higher social, no, finally, the last one has to do with a calling orientation, where you don't do it so much for the financial rewards, you don't do it so much for social approval, but you do it for the intrinsic work itself. The work itself is driving, you're passionate about it, and what it gives to others. Again, this is again intrinsic understanding. So we have job, which is extrinsic, career, which is kind of a mix of extrinsic and intrinsic, primarily social, and finally calling, which is really motivated by the intrinsic. A lot of people in the nursing professions will find that, and they don't like sometimes the demands that are put on them that don't allow them to serve their patients as well. But they're driven by that care, that sense of care, very intrinsic notion, this notion of care. So, okay, so we've already kind of discussed this. I'm going to breeze through this. I like those three distinctions, though. It's very helpful. And again, a lot of you are looking to different jobs that may be associated with psychology. Use that distinction, okay? I would hazard to say that just getting into psychology, if you're in a psychology-related job, just to get it, okay, because you took classes in that, now you're signed up for it, won't probably be as effective as one in which you perhaps get into the research, you like it, and then you're finding out how things go organizationally, and you're trying to go for a higher advancement, more challenge, more pay, prestige. It's probably a little step up, but even better than that is to find an area of research that you just absolutely love, you're intrigued by. It helps you understand your past patterns, helps you understand something about the world that's emerging that you could supply something really important to, be an expert on, a counselor on, and so forth. Oftentimes it can reflect your own experience. And that's what might be called a passion and a calling in terms of work. So definitely look into that. That's going to be very helpful. Let's see here. Okay. This had to do with leisure. Okay. Leisure activities have a more optional quality. They're not usually forced upon you, and that is a big difference. Okay. And there are a lot of motivations for leisure. This first motivation here is called mastery. It has to do with self-improvement and the richer pleasures that come with accomplishment and expertise. This has also to do with growth and learning. Another aspect is a sense of purpose or moral accomplishment. This is what he says, contribution, okay? What this person or what these authors call passion has to do with a certain kind of intense, focused leisure activity, okay? That can include almost anything. Passions include hobbies, stamp collecting, artistic creative activities, puzzles and games, you name it. Volunteerism, that could be another one as well. There are some, it shows most common passions among people. You can read that. I'm not going to go ahead and take a lot of time with it. Again, and there could be different purposes for leisure. An outlet for amusement and fun that's more consumption oriented, right? Consuming here. Video games would fall under that for sure. Versus, again, contributing, right? And again, research, again, focus, control, and creative expression. All right, that has to do more with the outpouring, the giving, the exerting, the producing, whereas these other ones tend to be more amusement and fun, tend to be more consuming. All right. Again, there's no problem with that. I'm not making a moral judgment here. I do a lot of consuming and watching films because and so forth, but I also try to do quite a bit of contributing as well. Contributing tends again to be a better way to develop a more intense passion, a long-lasting and healthier passion. Yeah, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. I wrote up here on this page. There's a balance that's needed in self-care here. People who become passionate but burnt out oftentimes extend themselves so much that they don't balance and have enough energy for themselves. In these examples here, right, you notice that people are working, but it doesn't feel like work. Those are the perfect jobs, right? The work itself is providing so much energy to you that the contribution you're going out is like a bank account. You're flush. You have a lot of money in your bank account because you're getting so much more by contributing. and it's not just wearing you down. This notion of food, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Um, there's just a couple of good points made in here. The combination of plentiful food and relative inactivity has led to an increased prevalence of obesity in the developed world. Um, and again, we've talked about this before. Oftentimes we consume, especially food, to fulfill an emotional need and in order to assuage or cover up or address or at least delay physical and emotional problems. And the thing that's important to understand is that it oftentimes creates a cycle in which this and continued delay creates its own problems. Things like obesity, things like binging and purging and efforts to control one's weight and one's body image that tend to be unhealthy. Okay, again, consumption tends to be instrumental or external, producing and creating more intrinsic and internal, and the same is true of food. When you're eating versus cooking, because they talked about the French versus the Americans. The French eat higher fat food, they seem to eat unhealthier food, and yet their health and their age and so forth are a lot better. I would contend that a lot of it has to do with this notion of seeing eating as an experience, especially when you're cooking it and appreciating it. Cooking is a contributing activity, a creating activity. It's intrinsic, right? It develops an appreciation for food. And you get a lot of the satisfaction of food from the smells, from the touching it, from the preparing of it. And so a lot of your hunger is not there as much as if you were just consuming it. Not to mention that the whole foods in France tend to be wholer foods and not these highly addictive foods like high fructose corn syrup, junk food that actually addictively, chemically and physically make it addictive for people. They send their blood sugar up and then crashing, and then they have to eat something out to get it up, and then it crashes again. So that was interesting. Go into this. Look a little bit about the difference between the French and the United States, and you get a little bit of interesting ideas about our emotions around food, French versus American. And again, especially around the notion of eating being more of an experience rather than just a taste thing. It's a social experience. People are spending a lot more time talking rather than shoving food, right? In the French culture, spending more time preparing it, smaller portions. So it's the fullness of the whole experience around eating that drives the French, whereas Americans tend to be much more targeted and instrumental about their eating. In fact, a lot of Americans, I think they showed in here, would just as soon take a pill. Like far more Americans would just take a pill because they want to do other things than actually spend the time eating real food if they had that option. So it says a little bit again more about the differences in our cultures. Americans more activity driven, feeling eating is just something to do to get their activity going. Where that's an instrumental idea of eating. Eat the food in order to do something else, versus the French, which see eating as an end in itself or an intrinsic activity. That is somewhere to go to collect with family, to collect with friends. It becomes a part of an experience, a social experience that's an end in itself, an intrinsic end or goal. So again, those are a couple of two differences between that. And again, if you want to have some understanding about the difference between intrinsic and instrumental, please check out my podcast that I did with Stuart Campbell on the Dead Greek Society. It's in the you can do it on iTunes, the Dead Greek Society. It's the first episode on instrumental versus intrinsic thinking. It's optional for this class, but I would recommend anyone do that. It's a nice, you can hear it in your car as you're driving or whatever. It's kind of makes some nice distinctions around those same kinds of ways. So I think the last thing I wanted to say was this last concluding line here. And that's an important and a good wrap up to what we're doing here. Overall, the more we know about the acquisition of intrinsic value and the development of values that extend beyond the self and the way that the cultural ecology promotes these, the more we will be able to make the most of most moments in our waking lives. I think that's a great way to go out, and I think that's a great one to take home with you. It's exactly right. Development of values, intrinsic values that extend beyond the self, contributing, creating, offering something into the world. and a cultural ecology, that is the way in which we construct our families, our homes, and our nations and our communities that promote that, the more we'll be able to make the most out of our lives. So anyway, that should pretty much do it in terms of the readings for this week. Again, I appreciate you taking the time to listen and to engage this material. You're doing very well with it. And until next time, this is Dr. Zeus checking out.